Okay, hi everybody. Excuse me. Let me just get the camera all ready for today's lesson. That seems to be okay. Now I'm sorry about that bit of light here. Perhaps if I turn that round a little bit. That will do, won't it? It's that way round. Yeah. Okay. So today I'm going to look at articles, but I'm looking at articles in one particular situation, and that's in the defining relative clause. And it's because I think there is quite a lot to learn about articles if we look at how they're used in defining relative clauses. It's quite interesting. Just have one quick last look to check that everything seems to be okay with the camera, and it does. Okay, so with defining relative clauses, look at the following sentence. The following two sentences are both defining relative clauses, but what I want you to understand is that most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, in the top sentence we would say the, most of the time, not all the time, and in the bottom sentence, most of the time, we would say a. And I want to explain why in terms of identifying clause and classifying clause. I found these two terms on a website somewhere, and I quite liked this as another explanation of the difference between the definite article and the indefinite article. So if we take the first sentence, he is the man whom I met yesterday. It's most likely that you'll use the here, because the refers to someone who the listener is already aware of. And if the listener is already aware of this man, or you only met one man yesterday, then in either of those situations you would use the. The only time you would say a is if the listener doesn't know who you mean, he doesn't have a concrete idea of who this is, because the is an identifying clause. It identifies who when we use the. If you met maybe lots of people yesterday and the listener doesn't know which man you mean and you're just introducing him, then we would say he is a man whom I met yesterday. And really, here, if we say a, we're not identifying the man, we're not saying which one, we're classifying this man. We're saying that he is a man whom I met yesterday. So we're answering the question, what kind of man is he? He is a man I met yesterday. We're not answering the question, which one. Identifying clauses with the answer the question, which one. Which one? The man whom I met yesterday. Whereas classifying clauses with a, they tell us what kind of one. So he is a man whom I met yesterday. It's telling us what kind of man he is. But most of the time we'll use that one, because most of the time we are identifying who he is. He is the man whom I met yesterday. That one, a very real, concrete one. So please use the for concrete people who the listener is already aware of. And I must make that clear. It's the listener who is important, the person you're addressing, the person you're talking to. Obviously, you're going to assume how much they know, and sometimes the assumption could be wrong, but it's the assumed knowledge of the listener. Just remember that a, firstly, there must be many if we're going to use a. And if we say he is a man whom I met yesterday, then it sounds like that you're just one of many. And it's because you're classifying with this sentence. Let's look at this one under the microscope. Let's check this one out. He is a man whom I deeply respect. Now, I hope you can see that often when you talk about yesterday, the man you met yesterday, with this clause, you're very often going to be identifying that man. But when you say whom I deeply respect, that sounds much more like a classification. You're not telling me which man exactly, you're telling me what kind of man he is. So even if you're talking about your brother, and you're talking to someone about your brother, and he already knows your brother, so he already knows which one, I think a lot of students would say, he already knows which one, so we must say, this guy is my brother, he is the man whom I deeply respect. Well, that's not correct, because you're still classifying. And so even if you're talking to someone who knows your brother, you still say, he is a man whom I deeply respect. And it's because you're answering the question, what kind of person is he? And not which person is he. It's not specific, this one. We're just saying that he's a man whom I deeply respect, but there are other men whom I deeply respect. He's one of many, so it must be one of many. When you use a, let's put that, must be one of many. And you must be answering the question of what kind of one is he or is it? I hope that helps for that particular defining relative clause. But again, we could say he is the man whom I deeply respect, but when we say that, we assume that the listener knows exactly which man I'm talking about. And it's not just that he knows which one I'm talking about. Let's make this really clear. It's that I am identifying it's the one he knows. He is the man whom I deeply respect. So even though we'd only use the here about 5% of the time and a here about 5% of the time, there is a context where it makes sense. Let me just go over it again, because I know how confusing this is for me as a teacher to explain. So if I say the less common one, he is a man whom I met yesterday, the only situation I would say this is if I met lots of people yesterday and I'm telling the listener that he is just one of the many people that I met yesterday. I'm classifying him as a man that I met yesterday, one among many. But most of the time, if I'm identifying him and saying that's the one I met yesterday, he is the man I met yesterday, that becomes concrete, and most of the time we'd say that. I think most of the time you are identifying him when you say this sentence, but it could be a classifying one. Coming on to the second one, he is a man whom I deeply respect, and let's say we're talking about my brother and the listener knows who it is. We'd still say he is a man whom I deeply respect, because we're talking about what kind of brother is he, what kind of guy is he. If we use the top one and say he is the man whom I deeply respect, this means that in the previous sentence I've just said that I really respect a guy and I really respect a man, and then I point at someone and say, look, there he is the man whom I deeply respect. Which is obviously not quite as likely. It's very unlikely that that will be the context. It's a very specific context. And then you are identifying him as the one, the concrete one, the one over there that you deeply respect. So there's something really concrete about they're already in existence, and there's something just classificatory. We're just classifying when we use a. We're not identifying. We're not saying that one. We're saying it's this kind of one. Okay, let's come on to some other examples, because the more examples you have, the more you'll understand the difference between a and the. So if I look at this example, this is a book that I told you about yesterday, or this is the book that I told you about yesterday. I think this is very similar to number one, because most of the time, and number one, let's say A and B here, number one A, it's very similar to number 1A, because most of the time we wouldn't say a book, most of the time we would say the book. The only situation when we would say a book is when there are many books that I told you about yesterday, and I've got many of them in front of me, and I say, here is a book that I told you about yesterday. This is a book that I told you about yesterday. And then we're classifying the book as just one of the many books that I told you about yesterday. But there are other books I have that I didn't tell you about yesterday, and they're perhaps on the pile as well. But most of the time, you'll be saying something like this. You'll be saying, this is the book that I told you about yesterday. And if you hold it up, it's really got to be the book. It becomes very concrete. It's the one here. So most of the time it will be this, and only a few percent again it will be A. But what's really important when we choose is, what does the reader or listener know about the book? Well, I told you about it yesterday, so he knows something. So he's already been introduced, and for that reason it's very unlikely to be A. Very unlikely. But if we assume that he doesn't know exactly which one, and I've got many of them there, many of the different ones that I told him about yesterday, then it could be A. But that's obviously very unlikely. Look at the next one, number 2. A woman who fell 20 metres was lifted to safety. I hope you can see again we've got a defining relative clause as we have in all of these examples. Now, the question is, doesn't this woman become definite with this defining relative clause? Well, if it's in a newspaper, no. If it's in a newspaper, this one will be much more common. And it's because the person who writes the article, the journalist, has already decided that you don't know this woman and that he's introducing her for the first time. And he's just classifying the fact that it was a woman who fell 20 metres who was lifted to safety. He's not identifying which one. So this really sounds like it's from the news. And the same with number 3. He told the MP the following in a July 23rd email. It sounds like it's in the news, and it sounds like the journalist has already assumed that you don't know anything about the July 3rd email. And so he introduces it with an A, and in the next sentence he uses a the. The same in number 2. He introduces her with an A, and then in the next sentence he says the woman, certainly. And she becomes very concrete, very specific, and he knows that you already know about her because he's just mentioned her. But again, it is possible to use this, the woman who fell 20 metres was lifted to safety. I would say that if I know that you already know who I'm talking about. And the same here. I would say the July 3rd email if I know that you already know about this email. And so it's all about the assumed knowledge of the listener or the reader. That's how we choose A or the. It's all about our assumption of what they know. Do they know this object, or have they never heard of this object? Do they not know which one? So it is about assuming, and it's about the other person, not ourselves. Let's have a look at a couple more examples. These were actually from a student who wrote an essay recently. And the student wrote, "Governments are elected by people." And I corrected it with "by the people." Now, why did I do that? I want you to think about the different meaning here, because they are different meanings. If we say governments are elected by people, then that just means anybody, first of all. I'm going to make a few points here why it doesn't sound so good with people. It sounds like a really obvious sentence. Governments are elected by people. Well, yeah, who else is going to elect governments? Frogs, bears, monkeys? Only people could elect. Yeah, only people can vote. And so it sounds to me like without the article, this sentence is stating the bleeding obvious. Yeah, it's stating something which is so obvious it doesn't need to be stated. However, when you add the article, the people, it sounds like one group of people, one specific group of people among many. And that is actually who chooses the government. It's not everybody. You might say, but everybody gets the vote, Dave. Well, that's not true. My children don't get to vote. They're too young. Lots of people actually, for one reason or another, they choose not to vote. And so governments are elected by the people, by a specific group of people who are called also the electorate. And when we put that word "the" in there, it means the electorate. It means one specific group of people, and that's why it really must be the people. And I want you to think about the old, I can't remember which American writer it was. Shame on me, I'm not very good with American history. But one of them said, we need government of the people, for the people, by the people. He put an article in each and every parallel phrase, and it's a lovely example of parallelism as well. But please notice that certainly you need the people there, and it means the ordinary people, not the aristocracy, not the oligarchs, but the group of people who make up the ordinary people of that country, the voters, the electorate. So it's not really true to say people, because that might mean kids as well. But anyway, it just sounds so meaningless. They're elected by people. Yeah, of course they're elected by people. They couldn't be elected by animals, but they're elected by the people, the electorate. Okay, one more sentence. They're working on the wording of the student wrote of the new law, and I understand why he chose the. It's because it's a defining relative clause. The new law, which new law? The new law which will allow us to vote online. Okay, I've changed that sentence a little bit, but it's just for this video, for the purpose of this video. I hope you can see this is very much a defining relative clause. It's defining the law, the new law. And for that reason, you might think, I need a definite article. Well, unfortunately, that's not all you need to think about. You need to think about, what about the reader or the listener? Now, the listener probably doesn't know about this new law. You're probably introducing this new law, and you're just classifying a new law that will allow us to vote online. You're not saying which one. You're just classifying. You really ought to use A here, and it's because you're introducing into existence this new law. And you probably... You think that the listener has no point of reference concerning this new law. If you say the, it sounds like one that they already know about. That's the thing, and quite often that's not the case, in which case you have to introduce the noun with a, with an indefinite article, because there's no point of reference. And I like that particular phrase for a. You use a when there is no point of reference, when there isn't one that you already know. So we don't have a point of reference here. We don't know which new law they're talking about that will allow us to vote online. And so the speaker certainly often would use an a here. The clue is in new, really. It's a new law, and so it ought not to be the. If you use the, then you're assuming that that person has already heard about the new law that will allow people to vote online. So it's all about the assumption of what the reader or listener knows. Okay, if you have any questions about articles, please put them under the video. There are lots of good questions you can ask about articles. Very difficult part of grammar. I sympathise with everybody trying to learn them, but I hope that with defining relative clauses, you can think about in future, am I identifying the man with the relative clause, or am I classifying a man, a noun, with the defining relative clause? Because it can be a classification, a defining relative clause. It doesn't have to identify. Okay, that's me babbling on about that already for quite some time. Thanks everybody for watching. If you've enjoyed it, please put a like under the video, and I hope to see you all soon.